So 40% of the electricity running through the American Pacific Northwest is actually controlled by a foreign country. Think about that for a second. Every time someone in Oregon or Washington turns on a light or a data center in Seattle processes a search or a factory in Portland powers up, there's a very high chance that the water spinning those turbines started in Canada. In fact, $8 billion worth of American crops and 42 million tons of cargo rely on that same water every single year. And yet, in July of last year, the decades-old agreement that keeps all of this running smoothly was quietly canceled. It wasn't a big, televised event. Most people didn't even notice. But by scrapping the modernized Columbia River Treaty, Washington might have just made the most expensive strategic error of the decade. And the thing is, this isn't really a story about trade or politics. It's a story about geography and the fact that you simply cannot negotiate with a river. To understand why this is such a massive deal, we have to look back at 1948. That spring, a city called Vanport, Oregon, was completely wiped off the map. A massive flood on the Columbia River destroyed the entire town in a matter of hours, leaving nearly 19,000 people homeless. It was a wake-up call for the United States. Washington realized that no matter how many dams they built on their own soil, they couldn't control the river. The headwaters were in Canada. If they wanted to stop the floods, they had to talk to their neighbors up north. So, they spent 16 years negotiating. We're talking about 3 different U.S. administrations and multiple Canadian governments. Eventually, in 1964, they signed the Columbia River Treaty. It was a massive sacrifice for Canada. They agreed to flood 110,000 hectares of their own land, drowning villages, sacred sites, and some of their best farmland just to build 3 massive dams. Those dams, the Mica, the Calais side, and the Duncan, gave Canada the power to control the flow of the entire river system. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to pay a rent for that water control. It's called the Canadian entitlement, and it's been worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year for 60 years. It was a win-win. The U.S. got flood protection and the backbone of their energy grid, and Canada got a steady stream of income. But the thing about 60-year-old deals is that they eventually need an update. By 2024, everyone knew the flood control provisions were about to expire. The Biden administration spent years working on a modernized version of the treaty, and they actually reached an agreement in principle. But then the transition happened. When the new administration took over in early 2025, they looked at this deal and saw it as a liability. They saw the money going to Canada as a concession they didn't want to make anymore. So, in March of 2025, Washington hit the pause button. They thought they could use the river as a bargaining chip in the broader trade war. The idea was that if they threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian electricity, Canada would eventually blink and give up more water for less money. But Canada didn't blink. And in July, Washington officially canceled the modernized deal. But here is where the math completely broke down. Because when you cancel a modernized update, the system doesn't just disappear. It reverts back to the original 1964 text. And that 1964 text is exactly what Canada wanted to keep. It's the version where they keep the control, they keep the payments, and they don't have to give the U.S. any new concessions. Washington thought they were taking away a Canadian win, but they actually threw away the only roadmap they had for their own energy security. There's a quote that perfectly explains this that said that it's always better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a right. And that is the reality that Washington seems to have missed. You can pass all the executive orders you want, but you can't force water to flow uphill. Think back to that press conference in Los Angeles. At the time, there was this idea floated that Canada has a very large faucet and that we could just turn it and send water down to California to solve their drought. Scientists spent weeks explaining that this is physically impossible. There are no pipes, no valves, and no way to move a river that far south. But that mindset, the idea that Canadian water is just American water waiting to be claimed, is exactly what led to this treaty cancellation. The Columbia River isn't just a scenic waterway. It's the fourth largest watershed in North America. It runs for 2,000 kilometers. The 60 dams on this system produce 40% of all the hydroelectric power in the U.S. And it's not just electricity. Think about the wheat exports. About 10% of all American wheat moves on barges down this river. 700 grain ships worth of cargo every year. If Canada decides to adjust the flow, not even shut it off, just move it slightly to prioritize their own needs, the economic shock would be staggering. Replacing the benefits of just one small section of this river system could cost up to $31 billion. Replacing the entire system, you're looking at hundreds of billions. And the thing is, even if you had the money, you couldn't build that infrastructure on a political timeline. It takes decades to build dams and power grids. Decades that the Pacific Northwest doesn't have. We can call this the domino sequence. We've seen this pattern over the last year. First it was lumber, then it was dairy, then it was tourism. Each decision looked like a separate trade fight. But the Columbia River is different. You can't replace a river with a spreadsheet. You can't rebuild a 60-year power network with a tariff. So where does this leave us? There are really only a few ways this can go. Washington could realize the mistake and quietly try to bring the modernized deal back to the table. That's the optimistic path, but it's unlikely given the current climate. The more likely scenario is that everything stays in this legal gray zone. The water keeps flowing for now. Canada keeps getting paid, and everyone just prays that we don't have a massive drought or a major flood. The real danger is escalation. If Washington goes through with those 100% electricity tariffs, Canada could respond by formally reducing their cooperation on water flow to the absolute legal minimum. We would see power shortages in the winter and irrigation problems in the summer. Shippers would see their barges stuck in low water. And once that 10-year clock to terminate the treaty starts ticking, there's no easy way to stop it. The Pacific Northwest has been the cheapest region for electricity in the developed world for 60 years because of this cooperation. That advantage is now sitting on a knife's edge. At this point, the person holding the faucet isn't in the White House. It's Mark Carney and the team in Ottawa. Every time Washington makes a demand about lumber or auto parts, they're doing it while sitting downstream from a river that Canada controls. It's the ultimate piece of hidden leverage. Washington hasn't even mentioned the Columbia River in their recent lists of demands, probably because they are hoping no one